Hi, Jimmy here. You find me on top of a medieval wall in the city of York, where I live, and I've got a lovely view of the city. It's just sort of evening time on a quiet Wednesday, and today we're going to talk about houses. Now, there are obviously hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of houses from the Viking Age, but I happen to live in a city where half a dozen of them have been found, and they come in all different shapes and sizes. Viking houses come in many, many forms depending on where you're looking for them. And one of the more common types of house that you've probably heard of is the longhouse. And a longhouse is what it sounds like. It's a house made out of wood and with either a thatched or wooden tiled roof normally that houses an extended family. So you'll have like half a dozen people maybe living in a longhouse. And this is something that isn't unique to Old Norse culture. There are certain North American cultures that use a similar kind of communal housing for their families, their extended families. And very often in the Old Norse world, this will be a farmstead. So like half a dozen people will be farming. The vast majority of people were farmers, and they'll be living in a longhouse. And longhouses are in use for hundreds of years in Scandinavia and in certain other parts of the Viking world. You find lovely examples of them in places like Trelleborg, which is an amazing place with fortified longhouses. So you've got these longhouses wonderfully geometrically set out, and then you've got this circular wall around them. So you get this fortified set of houses. And longhouses are great things. They are several meters wide by a couple of dozen meters long. They're built out of wood, and if you've ever played Valheim, you'll know that the walls there are like these vertical planks of wood with a horizontal slat at the back. Usually the walls that you see in the Viking Age are either that or the opposite, where it'll be vertical sort of poles with these horizontal slats in between them. But that's not the only kind of housing that they were using in the Viking Age. Of course, Old Norse people in various other places where there might have been less wood or where the weather was worse use different techniques. So you'll have houses made out of turf, originally enough called turf houses, where the turf will be stacked up and up and up, and then you'll have a turf roof over the top. And in films, in the Norseman, we see turf houses. So there are houses made out of turf, reinforced with stone around the lower portions of the building with a turf roof. And they're very hardy structures. They're very easy to make. Obviously, you just dig up some turfs, you build them up. Bob's your uncle, you've built a wall. You might have seen some of these. If you've ever been to Lanzo Meadows in Canada, you might have seen some of the reconstructions there where they've built some turf-style houses. And inside, they might also have some wooden panels on the walls just to make them, you know, nice and livable. These weren't people that wanted to live in squalid accommodation. And that kind of house is, again, fairly common. You will have an extended family living in there, and bear in mind the majority of people are farmers, so this is probably a family of farmers. There's another kind of house as well, a pit house, which is semi-subterranean. And these come in all sorts of sizes. So some of them look like they were actual full houses. Some of them might have been root cellars. Some of them seem to have been used as blacksmithing workshops, and they're, as the name implies, dug into the ground. Then you have a roof over the top, thatched or wooden again, and you get steps or a ramp that goes down into the house, and that's the building. It's a fairly good way of making a building that is weatherproof, because if something goes horribly wrong, it's just the roof that you need to replace instead of like the entire walls as well, because they can't blow down because they're under the ground. Smart. Now, I've been talking a lot about these rural settings where we have farmsteads, and I think a couple of people are going to start walking past me in a minute. We're just going to ignore them, that's fine. I'm in their way, if anything. And obviously, I'm here in York, which isn't a farmstead. It's not a rural area. In fact, in terms of the Viking Age, it's a city, like it's a trading hub. And in places like York and Dublin and Hedeby, you get a very different style of accommodation where you'll see tenements being built. And if you live in Scotland, you might think of a tenement as a block of flats, so like a big old, like what do they call them in North America? Like an apartment block, basically, where there will be lots of different sets of accommodation on each floor of a tall building. And when we talk about Viking Age architecture using tenements, what we're talking about is kind of plots of land. So a demarcated plot of land surrounded by some kind of boundary, whether that be a wall or a fence made of wattle and daub, or just a wattle fence that doesn't have any daub on it. And when I talk about daub, I mean poop. You slap a load of clay and a load of poo and a load of horsehair onto your wattle fence, so your woven wooden fence, and that weatherproofs it, and that might function as a wall of a structure. Speaking of wattle structures, in York there is a street called Coppergate, and in the mid-1970s into the early 80s, 76 to 81 I think, they excavated numbers 16 to 22 Coppergate. This is what it looks like now, and they demolished some Victorian buildings that were there, and underneath the site they found 4 Viking Age tenements. And they're quite interesting because they have a specific sort of form and a specific evolution. Initially, so basically the start of the 10th century, these are wattle buildings, and they are built on the surface, and they are just like little houses made of wattle and daub. Then we have another type of tenement house, which is made as a semi-subterranean house, so like a pit house, and they are, I think, about 4 meters wide by something like 40 meters long, these tenements. So they're plots, they're big plots where you can do crafting and you live, and maybe you have a couple of animals, you have a pig or two in the backyard, who knows. And we found 4 of them on Coppergate. I say we, I wasn't involved, I wasn't alive. And the wattle houses are pretty cool. Like, we have fun wattle fences in this rectilinear form, so like it has straight lines and is vaguely rectangular shaped. But we also have these pit houses, and the pit houses are really cool because they are clearly subterranean, like they are below ground level. They must have had a ramp or stepped access down, and inside they're really cozy. So they're not these squalid little cave-like structures that you might think of when you think of Viking Age homes or like ancient homes. They were really cozy. They had floorboards raised off the ground on battens of wood. The later ones, the late 10th century ones, also have drains in them made of wood, like wooden channels with wooden roofs on top of them. The floorboards are all cut so that they fit around the vertical posts that hold up the roof. The walls are made from these vertical posts with the horizontal slats of wood in between them. They're made out of oak, they're good quality, they're professionally made by carpenters and joiners on site. They're all professionally faced and like sawn and made. They're held together with pegs, and we have no idea what the tops of them looked like because they were completely like raised. They're like wheat before a scythe. There is nothing above ground level. They were completely raised after some of them less than a century of being around, and then new buildings were built on top of them with stone foundations and that sort of thing. But the plots are really cool because they basically stay the same for 1,000 years. So we have 16th and 17th century buildings on the same plots as these tenements, same width, same length. It's amazing. And in York, this was a huge find, and it was really cool. In Dublin, on Fishamble Street and Wood Quay, they have found more than 150 of these tenements, and they are strikingly similar. So we do have the same wattle buildings, we have the same pit houses with wooden walls. And clearly this was urban design in the Viking world. Like, this was the urbanization of the Old Norse. If they weren't living in longhouses and turf houses on farmsteads, they were living in small plots with individual houses built on them with a backyard. And classically, the layout of the house is exactly the same in either a longhouse or a turf house or one of these pit houses or a wattle house, be it in the countryside or in a city. And inside you will have a hearth in the center of the house, and they can be quite long. They can be like, I think, 3 or 4 meters long by a meter and a half or 2 meters wide. They're big old fireplaces, and the whole thing wasn't used to construct a fire. Like, it wouldn't have just had this massive 4x2 meter bonfire in it. That's insane, considering you're in a wooden house with a thatched roof. That's a bad move. But certain areas of it might have been used for warming food, for putting used ashes aside and that sort of thing. And how does that work in a house with wooden floorboards, I hear you ask? You put clay down. The clay forms the base of your fireplace. You line it either with wood or stones, And that is your hearth. And again, you don't put the entire thing on fire. Some of it is around the fire, and that means that you have protection from sparks and embers and that sort of thing. You can use some of the warm ashes to bake bread, for example, that kind of stuff. And every Viking Age house has this. It has this big central hearth. To the sides of the hearth, you will have benches. And in some of the Coppergate houses and the Dublin houses, these benches are earth, so they're like raised banks of earth with revetment. And revetment is basically when you put like a retaining wall, you stop that earth bench from just collapsing down onto the floor by putting wattle, calciprese, or wood or stone or whatever it may be, and it prevents your bench from collapsing in. And the benches generally are multi-purpose, so they might be for sitting on whilst you're working, pedestrians. They might be for sleeping on in the evenings. They might be for storing stuff on whilst you're working on things. But bear in mind, most of the manual labour in terms of like fine jewellery making and that kind of thing was probably being done outside because you have natural lighting. Much better to work by. We do have plenty of evidence from tenements in York and Dublin that work was being done inside. So we have loom weights from some of these houses. We know that looms were being used for weaving cloth. We have bead production materials. We have tools. We have metalworking tools. And we have literally dozens and dozens of iron spikes. What were they used for? We're not sure. Probably combing wool as part of the production of fabric. So I'm making a whole big thing about York having these 4. Dublin has 150 plus of these houses. They found like 200 buildings just in this part of Dublin. It's a huge excavation. But I live like 10 minutes walk away from where they found these Viking houses. And the backyards of these houses tended to have things in them like a waste pit. It's just marked pit on this, which is quite ominous. It'll be the midden, a waste pit for you to just chuck oyster shells or fish bones or manufacturing waste, bits of scrap leather into it, that kind of thing. Then there will be a latrine pit, like an actual toilet. Later in the 12th and 13th centuries, we have evidence that these were like proper toilets with wooden seats with a hole in it for your bum to go into. And then you will have a path which will either be metalled, so it'll have cobblestones on it, or it'll be made of planks, or it'll be made of our old friend wattle, and it'll be a woven wooden path. We have plenty of these wooden paths from places like Dublin. So these were full, like, they were streets, they were plots of land on streets that had been completely turned into an urban environment. Like, this is actually like, imagine a row of terraced housing where you've got the road, you have the street, you have Coppergate, and we know that the Anglo-Saxons were putting cobbles down on their streets. You look around you, you have houses on plots separated by fences. We don't know if these houses in York will have had another story on top of them. Some of them might have had a second story. Some of them might have just had the roof, like the pit house, flush with the ground. It's difficult to know in this context in York because, like I said, everything was completely dismantled and salvaged down to ground level after 100 years. So did they have a second floor? Maybe. There's some evidence of post holes for holding up the roof. Were they just underneath, like the roof goes like that, right? Are they just here on the ground, or are they like holding up the roof above the ground level for a second story? We're not sure. We have posts like that in longhouses, and they're certainly above ground, so possibility of either or. We're not completely sure. There's nuance to it. We don't know. It was 1,000+ years ago. But we've got amazing evidence of the craft production going on in these places. So like people's houses were also their places of work. Much like today, people were working from home and producing jewellery and beads. In York, we have amazing like piles of raw jet and amber from a couple of these tenement houses. One of the other houses is absolutely full of plant dyeing stuff. So plant dyes and materials for dyeing and weaving and producing fabric. It's absolutely fantastic. And these urban settings are where we get the really big concentrations of artefacts. So if you go to somewhere like the National Museum of Archaeology in Dublin, you will see a tiny fraction of what they found in these excavations because there's just not enough room to display all of these artifacts. They found 40,000 artifacts just from the Coppergate excavation. It was absolutely mental, the amount of stuff they found. And they found a poo. They found a coprolite from one of the other sites nearby, the Lloyd's Bank coprolite. It's one of the biggest human poops we've ever excavated. And it's fascinating. It tells you that they had worms in their intestines. It tells you what kind of flies were laying eggs in their poop. It tells you what their diet was like. Pretty bad. So these urban settings, these urban houses, although they are fundamentally very different beasts to the longhouses that you get at places like Trelleborg, and they're different to the turf houses that you see in places like Iceland, they are still fundamentally 4 walls and a roof with a hearth in the middle. No, they didn't have chimneys, they just have a hole in the thatch. Yes, they got extremely smoky. Experimental archaeology tells us it would have been borderline unbearable by modern European standards, so they were pretty smoky. But that's kind of a very brief overview. There's a load of reading in the comments in the description for this video, so feel free, go down there. York Archaeological Trust has released some of their fascicules, some of their reports for this excavation, so I've linked to some of those in the description of the video if you want to learn more about this. Check out some of these museums, check out places like Jorvik Viking Centre and their publications, or the National Museum of Ireland Archaeology's publications. They're absolutely fantastic. There's a place called Dublinia in Dublin that looks at it as well. So go and check out some of these places. The National Museum of Denmark has a fantastic series of publications on Viking Age housing and archaeology. So I will leave you with this lovely sunset and say diolch yn fawr iawn am ymuno. Thank you very much for joining. If you want to support the channel financially, we have the Patreon, we have the coffee. Thank you to all my patrons. You are amazing. And tan y tro nesa, till the next time, hwyl fawr. Bye-bye. Switch that around. Oh, it's nice sunset-ish, sort of, nearly. It's nearly a nice sunset. It'll be a nice sunset eventually.